She arrived in Harlan Crossing on a Thursday in late October, with a satchel that held less than most people carry to church and a sewing box that had belonged to her mother. The town was the kind of place that remembered everything and forgave very little. And the people standing outside the dry goods store that morning watched her walk up the main road the way people watch weather coming in from the west, quietly and with some calculation about what it might cost them. Her name was Willa Crane. She was a widow, though the word sat on her the way an ill-fitting coat sits on a woman who never asked for it. Her husband had left her two things when he died: his debts and his name. She had kept the name because it was easier. She had worked on the debts every day since. She did not ask for sympathy. She did not expect any. She sat down by the window of that store and opened her sewing box and got to work, because that was the only philosophy she had ever needed. There is a kind of woman the frontier made without meaning to. Not a woman who wanted hardship, but a woman who met it so many times that she stopped flinching. A woman who learned that dignity is not something given to you by a town or a husband or a favorable set of circumstances. It is something you carry, the way you carry a needle. Small, quiet, and useful, in ways people only notice when things start to come apart. Willa was that kind of woman. Harlan Crossing did not know what to do with her. It rarely does with women like that. The man behind the counter of the dry goods store was named Frank Aldred. He was not a man who spoke often, and when he did, he was not in the habit of saying more than the situation required. He had run the store alone for 3 years. He kept his accounts in order, his shelves level, and his opinions to himself. The town trusted him with their flour and their credit, and not much else. He had watched a great many people come through Harlan Crossing without attaching himself to any of them. He was not cold. He was simply a man who had learned to wait and see, and who had not yet seen anything that changed his mind about waiting. Some stories do not announce themselves. They begin on an ordinary morning with an ordinary task, in a town that has already decided how the ending goes. And then something small happens: a coat set on a peg, an envelope left without explanation, 4 words spoken across a counter near closing time, and the town finds out it was wrong. This is one of those stories. It belongs to a woman with a needle and a spine and 11 cents in her coat pocket, and to a man who said very little but meant every word of it. The morning Willa Crane walked into Harlan Crossing, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind came down off the ridge with a particular coldness that October saves for its last few days. The road into town was unpaved and wide and empty, except for a wagon moving slowly toward the livery and a dog sleeping in the dirt outside the barber's shop. Willa walked the length of it with her satchel over one shoulder and her mother's sewing box tucked under her arm. She did not hurry. There was nowhere to hurry to. She had 11 cents in the pocket of her coat. She had counted them that morning at the stage stop, pressing each one between her fingers in the dark before the others woke, the way a person counts what they have left when they are not sure it will be enough. It was not enough. She knew that. But 11 cents and a sewing box and a willingness to work were more than nothing, and Willa Crane had built entire seasons out of less than that. The dry goods store sat near the center of the main road, between the post office and a building that served as both a land office and a dentist's depending on the day. It had a covered porch with 2 chairs on it that nobody seemed to use and a hand-painted sign above the door that read, Aldred General Goods, in letters that had once been black and were now more of a dark gray. The window was clean. That was the first thing Willa noticed. In a town like Harlan Crossing, a clean window meant someone paid attention. She pushed open the door and went inside. The store smelled of cedar and lamp oil, and something faintly sweet that turned out to be a wheel of hard candy near the counter. The shelves were orderly, bolts of cloth on the left, dry goods down the center, tools and hardware along the back wall. A wood stove in the corner gave off a low, steady heat. There was a man behind the counter writing something in a ledger. He did not look up when she came in. He finished the line he was writing, set down his pen, and then looked up. He had steady gray eyes and a face that did not give away much. He waited. "I am looking for work," Willa said. She did not apologize for it or dress it in extra words. "I sew and mend. I can also keep inventory, and I write a clear hand. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for a fair wage for fair work." The man, Frank Aldred, though she did not know his name yet, looked at her for a moment the way a man looks at something he is trying to place. Not unkindly, but without any hurry. He glanced at the sewing box under her arm. Then he looked back at her face. "I have no position," he said. And then, after a pause that lasted just long enough to mean something, "But I have a chair by the window, and more mending than I have time for. Sit down if you want the work. We can talk about wages after I see what you can do." Willa set her satchel down beside the chair by the window and opened her sewing box and got to work. That was a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, she had mended a wool coat with a torn lining, let out the seams on a pair of trousers that had been brought in by a farmer's wife, and repaired the hem of a Sunday dress that had caught on a nail. She worked without comment and without interruption. Frank Aldred moved around the store doing what he did, tallying, stacking, speaking briefly to the 2 or 3 customers who came in during the day, and did not bother her. He brought her a cup of coffee in the morning without asking if she wanted one. She said, "Thank you." He nodded and went back to the counter. That was the extent of their conversation for most of those first 2 days, and neither of them seemed to find it lacking. The town, however, had opinions. Harlan Crossing was not a large settlement. It had perhaps 200 souls and the usual arrangement of businesses and personalities that 200 souls produce. A minister, a schoolteacher, 3 women who considered themselves the keepers of the town's social account book, and 1 woman in particular who could be relied upon to speak what the others only thought. Her name was Martha Plum. She was the wife of the man who owned the feed store 2 doors down, and she had lived in Harlan Crossing long enough to feel she had some authority over it. Martha Plum came into Aldred General Goods on Saturday morning, ostensibly for sugar and thread, and spent a noticeable amount of time standing near Willa's chair without actually speaking to her. She examined the work on the counter. She looked at the sewing box. She looked at Willa's hands. Then she moved to the counter and spoke to Frank in a voice designed to be heard across the room. "I heard she is the Crane widow," Martha said, "from Overdeacon County. I heard her husband left considerable debts." Frank wrote something in his ledger. "I heard the same," he said. "It seems an unusual arrangement," Martha said. "She mends," Frank said. "I needed mending done." He turned a page. "Will that be the sugar and the thread, Martha?" Martha Plum bought her sugar and her thread and left. Willa did not look up from the coat she was working on. She pulled the needle through the wool with the same even tension she had used all morning. Some things are too small for answering. She had learned that a long time ago. What the town did not know, what it would take time and proximity to understand, was that Willa Crane had not come to Harlan Crossing for approval. She had come because the stage stopped here, and she had 11 cents and a skill and enough spine to turn those 3 things into something livable. She did not need the women at the dry goods counter to think well of her. She needed thread and a lamp and a place to sleep, and she was working toward all 3 in the only way she knew, with her hands, 1 stitch at a time. By the end of that first week, Frank Aldred had paid her a fair wage in coin, and told her the chair by the window was hers each morning, as long as she wanted it. He said this the way he said most things, plainly, without decoration, looking at her steadily, and then looking away. She thanked him. He said there was no need. She came back Monday morning, and the chair was there, and so was the coffee. and that was how the arrangement became a thing that existed in the world. The town watched. The town talked. And Willa Crane sat by the clean window of Aldred General Goods with her needle and her sewing box and her 11 cents turned into something more, and she did not ask anyone's permission to be there. Outside, the last of October moved toward November, and the cold came down off the ridge a little further each morning, and the light in the valley grew thin and pale and still, the way light does when winter is making up its mind. November came in without ceremony. The pass above the valley closed on the 4th of the month, the way it always did, and Harlan Crossing settled into the particular quiet of a place that knows it is on its own until spring. The supply wagons would not come again until the thaw. People counted what they had and made decisions accordingly. They patched instead of replacing. They repaired instead of discarding. And so the chair by the window of Aldred General Goods became, in its quiet way, one of the more essential spots in town. Willa worked steadily through those first weeks of November. Word had moved through Harlan Crossing the way word always moves in small places, not loudly, but completely. And women began bringing her things. A child's coat with a split seam, a husband's work shirt worn through at the elbows, a tablecloth that had seen one too many harvests. Willa took each item and examined it the way a person examines something they are trying to understand, turning it in the light, feeling the weight of the fabric between her fingers. Then she quoted a price and got to work. She did not overcharge. She did not undercharge. She was exact. The way people are exact when they have had to account for every cent for a long time. Frank Aldred assigned her small additional tasks as the weeks passed, without explanation or ceremony. He asked her one morning if she could manage the thread inventory, since he kept running short of colors he did not realize he was low on. She said she could. He showed her the ledger page where he kept it, handed her the pencil, and that was that. A week later, he asked if she was comfortable minding the counter when he needed to take deliveries around back. She said she was. He did not thank her excessively or make a point of it. He simply adjusted to the fact of her competence the way a careful man adjusts to any useful thing, quietly and with appreciation that did not need to be announced. The work suited her. That was the plain truth of it, and Willa was a woman who dealt in plain truths. She liked the orderliness of the store, the logic of inventory, the satisfaction of a mended seam that lay flat and held firm. She liked the low sound of the wood stove and the way the light came through the clean window in the afternoon, falling across her work in long, pale bars. She liked that Frank Aldred did not fill the silence with noise. There had been enough noise in her life, raised voices, slammed doors, the particular loudness of a man who mistakes volume for authority. The quiet of the store was not emptiness. It was something more like rest. She noticed things about him the way you notice things about a person you spend hours near without speaking. He kept his store the way a man keeps something he values but does not talk about valuing. The shelves were always straight. The scale on the counter was always clean. When a customer came in uncertain about what they needed, he did not sell them more than they came for. When old Mr. Hessler came in on credit again for the 3rd week running, Frank wrote it in the ledger without comment and without the particular expression some men use to remind a person of what they owe. He was not a soft man, but he was a fair one, and in Willa's experience, fairness was considerably rarer and considerably more useful than softness. The coat happened on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of November. Frank had left it draped over the back of the chair near the stove, a heavy wool coat, dark brown, with a lining that had come away from the collar and a button missing on the left cuff. He had not asked her to look at it. It was simply there. The way things are, simply there in a place where 2 people work in close quarters long enough. Willa finished the shirt she was working on, set it aside, and picked up the coat. The lining work took her the better part of an hour. The button she matched from a card in the sewing box, not identical, but close enough that you would not notice unless you were looking for the difference. She pressed the seams flat with her thumbnail the way her mother had taught her, hung the coat on the peg by the back door, and went back to her chair. Frank found it there the next morning. He stood in front of it for a moment. He did not say anything. He lifted it from the peg and put it on, and checked the cuff where the button had been. Then he hung it back up and went to the counter and opened the ledger. That was all. But that evening, when Willa was putting on her own coat to leave, she noticed that he had moved his coat to the peg nearest the stove, away from the draft near the back door. He had not mentioned the repair. He had not needed to. Some acknowledgments do not require words. This was the kind of man Frank Aldred was. One who showed what he thought through the care he took with things, not through what he said about them. Martha Plum came in twice more that week. She bought lamp oil on Wednesday and a pound of dried beans on Friday, and both times found a reason to linger near the counter long enough to observe the arrangement by the window. On Friday, she brought her friend Clara Voss, who was a quieter woman but no less watchful. The two of them spoke in the particular low voice that is not actually low, the kind designed to reach the ears it is meant to reach while appearing not to. Willa heard her name. She heard the word arrangement. She heard the phrase not entirely proper, spoken by Clara Voss with the careful enunciation of a woman who considers precision a form of virtue. Willa pulled her thread through a piece of blue wool and said nothing. She had learned long ago that the worst thing a woman in her position could do was answer. Answering meant engaging, and engaging meant giving the thing oxygen. Let it sit without air long enough, and it could not sustain itself. Frank, for his part, sold Martha and Clara what they came for, and bid them good afternoon with the same even courtesy he used for everyone. He did not defend Willa. He did not need to. The arrangement spoke for itself, and he was a man who trusted what things said for themselves over what people said about them. By the end of November, Willa had saved enough to pay a full month's rent on the small room she was taking above the post office, with a little set aside besides. She had a lamp and enough oil to last the winter and a wool blanket she had purchased at cost from Frank's inventory. She had made one or two careful acquaintances in town. The schoolteacher, a young woman named Ada Pine, who had the frank manner of someone trained to deal with other people's children, and had extended that frankness to Willa, without any of the calculation the other women brought to it. These were small things. But Willa Crane had always known how to build from small things. She was patient the way people are patient when they have learned that time, used carefully, is not lost. Every morning she came back to the chair by the window. Every morning the coffee was there, and every morning the light came through the clean glass and fell across her hands, and the work went on, one stitch at a time, in the good quiet of the store. The man's name was Gerald Holt, and he arrived in Harlan Crossing on a Wednesday in the first week of December, driving a buckboard with a canvas cover and the look of a man who had made a calculation and liked the result. He ran a dry goods operation out of Millhaven, which was a larger settlement 2 days' ride to the east, and he came to Harlan Crossing twice a year to look at what the smaller stores were doing and see if there was anything worth acquiring. He was not an unkind man, exactly. He was simply a man who thought of people the way he thought of inventory, useful in the right place, replaceable in the wrong one. He came into Aldred General Goods on that Wednesday morning, and he saw Willa at the window, and he watched her work for a while without announcing himself. Then he introduced himself to Frank, talked suppliers and pricing for a quarter of an hour, and on his way out stopped at the window and told Willa she sewed a fine seam. She thanked him without looking up. He said he had been looking for someone with her particular skill for his Millhaven store. He named a wage. It was more than Frank paid her. He named the terms: a proper room above the store, a small coal stove, steady work through winter and into spring. He said she could think on it and give him her answer before he left town on Friday. Willa looked up at him then. She looked at him the way a woman looks at an offer she is taking seriously. Steadily, without flattery, and without immediate refusal. She said she would think on it. Gerald Holt nodded and went out, and the bell above the door settled back into silence, and the store was quiet again. Willa looked at her work for a moment. Then she picked up her needle and continued. Frank had been at the back of the store during the conversation, taking stock of the hardware shelves. He had heard it. Willa knew he had heard it because there was a particular quality to the silence that followed Gerald Holt's exit. A stillness that was different from the ordinary stillness of the store. The way a room feels different when something has been said in it that has not yet been answered. Frank did not come to the front of the store. He did not comment. He finished what he was doing at the hardware shelves and then went to the counter and opened his ledger, and the afternoon continued as it always did. Willa thought about the offer that evening in her room above the post office. She sat by her lamp with her hands folded and thought about it the way she thought about all serious things, without sentiment from the outside in. Millhaven was larger. The wage was better. A coal stove was not a small thing in December. There was nothing in Harlan Crossing that belonged to her. No family, no land, no bond that had been spoken out loud. She had a chair by a window and a cup of coffee each morning, and the quiet of a store run by a man who treated her fairly. These were good things, but good things were not the same as reasons. She was still thinking about it on Thursday morning when she came in and found the coffee already poured and waiting on the corner of the counter nearest her chair. She hung up her coat and sat down and picked up her work. Frank was already at the ledger. The morning passed the way mornings passed in the store. Orders, a few customers, the sound of the stove, the light shifting as the clouds moved over the valley. At noon, Frank went to the back room and came out with bread and a piece of hard cheese, and set half of it on the corner of the counter without comment. Willa took it and thanked him. He nodded and ate standing up, reading something in a supply catalog, and neither of them spoke for a while. Some things are too large for naming. Willa had known this for a long time. She knew it the way she knew how to gauge the tension on a thread before it breaks, not from being told, but from handling the thing itself often enough to feel what it could bear. What she and Frank Aldred had built in 2 months of mornings and ledger pages and repaired coats and shared noons was not nothing. She could not have told you exactly what it was, but she knew the weight of it, and she was not careless with things that had weight. Friday morning came cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes the whole valley ring like struck iron. Gerald Holt would leave before noon. Willa came into the store at her usual time. Frank was not at the counter. She hung her coat on the peg and opened her sewing box and sat down, and after a few minutes, Frank came in from the back, brushing sawdust from his sleeve. He had been doing something in the storeroom. He went to the counter and then stopped, and she heard him open the small wooden box where he kept the day's coin. She did not look up. She heard the small sound of coins being counted and set on the wood. Then she heard him set something on the counter beside her sewing box. She looked. It was an envelope. Her name was written on the front in Frank's hand. Careful, plain letters, the handwriting of a man who learned to write for utility and had never seen a reason to ornament it. She looked at it for a moment, then she opened it. Inside was her week's wage, which she had expected, and beside it, folded separately, was a second amount. No note. No explanation. The second amount was enough to close the gap between what Gerald Holt had offered and what she earned here. It did not exceed it. It met it exactly. Willa looked at the envelope for a long time. She looked at the careful handwriting of her name on the front. She looked across the store at Frank, who had turned back to the counter and was writing in the ledger with the focused attention of a man who is determined to find the current page extremely interesting. He was not a man who made speeches. He was not a man who asked for things directly. He was a man who set an envelope on a counter and went back to his ledger and let the thing speak for itself. Because in his experience, the things that mattered most were the ones that did not need explaining. She put the envelope in her coat pocket. She threaded her needle. And when Gerald Holt stopped in on his way out of town an hour later, hat in hand, and asked if she had made her decision, Willa looked up from her work with the calm expression of a woman who has already put the question to rest. She thanked him for the offer. She said she was staying on in Harlan Crossing. Gerald Holt looked at her and then at Frank, who was measuring out flour for a customer and paying no visible attention to any of it. Holt nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he understands something he was not told. He said he hoped it worked out. He went out, and the bell above the door rang once and was quiet, and the store settled back into itself like a man settling into a chair he knows well. December settled over Harlan Crossing the way it always did, without apology and without any particular interest in what the people living there thought about it. The snow came on a Sunday night, and by Monday morning, the main road was white, and the rooftops were white, and the ridge above the valley was gone entirely, absorbed into a sky the color of unbleached wool. The cold was the kind that got into buildings through the gaps around doors and window frames, that made the wood stove work harder and made people move a little closer to it without discussing the matter. It was the kind of cold that reminded a person what it meant to be warm. Willa came to the store each morning through that cold with her coat buttoned to the throat and her sewing box under her arm. And the coffee was always there when she arrived, and the stove was always already going. She did not know what time Frank came in to start it. She did not ask. There are questions a person does not ask because the asking would make too much of something that is better left as a simple fact. The fire is lit, the coffee is poured, and that is enough to know. The boy first appeared on a Tuesday in the second week of December. He was perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with dark eyes and a coat that was somewhat too large for him, and boots that were somewhat too small. His name, Willa learned later, was Samuel, and he lived at the orphan house up the road with 5 other children under the care of a tired woman named Mrs. Garrett, who did her best with what the county provided, which was never quite sufficient. Samuel had developed the habit of walking past the store on his way back from school and slowing down near the window where the light was warm, and the woman inside moved her hands in the particular rhythmic way of someone who knows what they are doing. One afternoon he stopped entirely. He stood on the porch with his face near the glass for a long moment. Willa looked up and saw him and did not make a fuss of it. She simply moved her chin toward the door. He came inside. He sat on the floor near the stove at first, not speaking, watching her hands. She let him watch. Frank glanced over once from the counter, said nothing, and went back to what he was doing. The boy came back the next afternoon, and the one after that. By the end of the week he was sitting in the second chair, a chair that had appeared near the stove without any announcement, set there by Frank at some point between one afternoon and the next. Samuel still did not say much, but he watched Willa's hands with the concentrated attention of a child who is learning something, and occasionally he handed her a spool of thread when she reached for one, anticipating which color she needed with the quiet accuracy of a person who has been paying close attention. Martha Plum came in on a Thursday and saw the boy in the chair and Willa at the window and Frank at the counter, and she stood for a moment looking at the 3 of them with an expression that was difficult to read. She bought her sugar. She did not say anything about the arrangement. She said good afternoon when she left, and Frank said good afternoon back, and that was, in its small way, something different from what had come before. It was not an apology. It was not a concession spoken out loud, but it was close to one, and in Harlan Crossing, close was often the best a person was going to get. The shelf appeared on a Friday. Frank had been in the storeroom for most of the morning, and there had been the sound of wood being worked, measured, cut, fitted. In the patient, unhurried way Frank did all things. When Willa came back from the noon hour, There was a new shelf along the wall beside her chair. It was lower than the others, set at the right height for a person sitting down, and it was wider than it needed to be for any obvious commercial purpose. It was, in fact, exactly the right width for a sewing box and a few spools of thread and a small pair of scissors. Frank was at the counter when she came in. He did not look up. She looked at the shelf, and then at him, and then back at the shelf. She set her sewing box on it. It fit as though the shelf had been made for it, which it had. Christmas came and went quietly. Willa made Samuel a pair of wool mittens from scraps, good thick ones, with a sturdy seam she doubled twice to make sure they would hold. She left them on the chair near the stove on Christmas Eve without a card. When Samuel came in after the holiday, his hands were inside them, and he looked at her with the expression children use when they want to say something they do not have the words for yet. She told him he was welcome before he could try. He nodded and sat down in his chair, and the afternoon went on. It was a Thursday evening in the last week of December when Frank spoke. The store was closed, or nearly so. Samuel had gone back to the orphan house an hour before. The last customer had been and gone. Willa was finishing a piece of work by lamplight, a christening gown for a woman out on the Halverson farm, fine white cotton with a narrow hem that wanted all her attention. The store was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the pines along the ridge in a long, low sound that was almost like breathing. Frank was doing the day's accounts at the counter. He set down his pen. He looked at her in the lamplight for a moment, the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about for a long time and has finally decided to say out loud. He said, "You sew a fine seam, Mrs. Crane." His voice was even and unhurried, the way his voice always was. Willa pulled her thread through the white cotton and smoothed the hem with her thumb. She looked up at him. She said, "A seam is only as good as what it holds together." Frank looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said in the same even voice, "I wonder if you would consider staying on. Not for wages this time, in a different capacity." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The words sat in the quiet store between them, plain and serious and without any decoration. And Willa understood every word of what he had not said as clearly as if he had read it aloud from a page. She set down the christening gown. She looked at him across the store, at the steady gray eyes and the careful hands, and the man who had set an envelope on a counter without a note and built a shelf without being asked, and started a fire every morning before she arrived. She thought of the coffee on the corner of the counter. She thought of the chair near the stove. She thought of a boy with 2 large mittens and the particular quality of silence in a room where no one needed to prove anything. She said, "I would consider it." Frank looked at her for one more moment. Then he said, "Good." He picked up his pen and went back to the accounts. And Willa picked up the christening gown and went back to the hem, and the wind moved through the pines outside, and the lamp burned between them, and the evening continued in the warm and quiet dark. The fire burned on through the night. The snow held on the rooftops and the ridge and the long slope of the pasture behind the store. The horse in the corral stood still under the cold sky, its breath rising in slow white plumes. The pines along the ridge held the wind the way they always had, bending a little and then straightening, as they had done through every winter before this one, and would do through every winter after. The chimney of Aldred General Goods sent its smoke up straight into the clear December air, visible from most of the main road, a thin gray line against the white and the dark. In the morning the town would wake and the road would fill, and life would continue as it always did. And in the store by the window the chair was there, and the shelf was there, and the sewing box sat on the shelf where it belonged, and the seam held. And that was the story of Willa Crane and Frank Aldred, a woman who arrived in a cold town with 11 cents and a sewing box and the kind of spine that does not ask permission, and who left with everything that actually matters. Let me know in the comments how this one felt. I hope it found you well. See you in the next one.